When historians describe the Seattle Regrade Projects between 1898 and 1911, they usually focus on the engineering triumph above ground, the flattening of steep hills, the hydraulic sluicing of millions of tons of earth, the creation of buildable land for a booming city. But the real story, the one that barely appeared in newspapers, the one that even today sits buried in archival footnotes, began below the surface. It started with a simple urban planning decision. Engineers were instructed to level the hills across downtown Seattle, wash away the inconvenient terrain, and determine whether the ground beneath could support a modern metropolis. The goal was practical: create flat streets, improve transportation, and prepare for the city's explosive growth following the Klondike Gold Rush. But the moment workers began cutting into the hills and excavating the lowlands, something unexpected happened. They broke through layers that hadn't been exposed in living memory. Beneath the hillsides, deeper than any settler construction reached, the crews found walls and streets that didn't match the timeline of Seattle's official founding in 1851. Their alignment was deliberate, their depth was unusual, and the construction didn't resemble the rough timber and brickwork of pioneer Seattle. It didn't even resemble anything documented in the historical record. This wasn't mentioned in the public reports celebrating the Regrade's progress. It didn't make it into the newspapers praising the transformation of the landscape. But in the internal notes of those years, a quiet phrase appears over and over again: pre-existing structures, unexpected foundations, older than city records. The official story would later simplify all of this into remnants from the 1889 Great Fire, debris from early settlement, or simply buried construction materials. Nothing unusual, nothing worth discussion. But the excavation photographs from the time, the ones developed in engineering offices while Seattle celebrated its modernization, show something different. They show workers standing beside stone foundations cut with precision far cleaner than pioneer tools should allow. Structures fitted together so tightly that even in the grain of early 1900s photography, the craftsmanship is unmistakable. Street systems and drainage networks that don't resemble hasty frontier construction, but something older, more planned, more deliberate. And the deeper they excavated, the more the layers stopped looking like the scattered remnants of a young American city, and more like an entire urban infrastructure that had been buried, covered over, and deliberately forgotten. At first, the excavation teams tried to categorize everything in the simplest way possible: old boardwalks buried in mud, collapsed buildings from the fire, natural sediment accumulation. But as notes accumulated and more structures were uncovered, the inconsistencies multiplied. Why were some of the foundations built to support weights far greater than the wooden buildings supposedly erected above them? Why were certain stones shaped in modular form, as if mass-produced rather than individually cut? Why did some street systems extend into areas that no city plans showed any construction? And the question that troubled even the most experienced engineers: why were these buried structures so extensive? Seattle's regrade required precise surveying, yet the infrastructure beneath parts of downtown appeared built for a city far larger and more developed than the rough lumber town supposedly established in the 1850s. Survey teams quietly admitted among themselves that the scale and sophistication didn't line up with any pioneer records. And although none of them were using terms like lost civilizations, they were acknowledging something just as unsettling. Someone had built on this land before. Not cabins, not temporary camps, a city. As the documentation increased, so did the silence. Reports became shorter, descriptions became vague, photographs stopped showing the widest views of what was uncovered. And then the excavation zones were filled in throughout the early 1900s, covered with regraded earth where needed for development. And much of what was exposed was returned to darkness. Only fragments remain, notes, a handful of photographs, and the quiet testimonies of archivists who saw the files before some of them disappeared. But even from what survives, a pattern becomes visible. Structures too sophisticated for frontier Seattle, stonework too precise for the accepted timeline, construction methods that look inherited rather than improvised, infrastructure that seems to belong to a different era of urban planning entirely. When the excavation teams moved past the first recognizable layers beneath Seattle's hills, the expectations were simple. They believed they would find natural glacial deposits, perhaps some scattered pioneer debris, and the muddy remnants from the 1889 fire that destroyed much of the downtown. Nothing unusual, nothing extraordinary. But within months, that assumption collapsed because instead of a straightforward geological sequence, the teams uncovered a stack of urban layers that didn't behave the way the history of a normal frontier town is supposed to behave. If you're finding this investigation compelling, consider subscribing. These mysteries don't fit neatly into official history, and uncovering them requires looking where conventional narratives refuse to go. The first anomaly was alignment. Each layer, post-fire reconstruction, pre-fire settlement, and whatever lay beneath, seemed to follow the same street grid, the same angles, the same geometric orientation. Different building periods shouldn't do that. Different builders, different purposes, different decades. They don't build in perfect alignment with infrastructure that supposedly didn't exist yet. Yet beneath Seattle, they did. Streets from one era ran directly above streets buried meters below them. Foundation walls shared the same orientation even when separated by what should have been generations of construction. Drainage systems followed trajectories that seemed planned from a single master design, one that no city planner of record ever drew. It was as if every group that ever built on this ground was following an original blueprint, one that no longer existed in any municipal archive. Precision beyond pioneer capability. As the workers dug deeper into the hillsides, the layers became stranger. Beneath the expected mud and timber, they began encountering stonework that looked nothing like rough frontier construction. Much larger foundations, much tighter joints. Patterns that seemed too mathematically precise for anything in Seattle's documented timeline. Some structures appeared almost overbuilt, stone arches with flawless curvature, retaining walls crafted with precision that didn't match the crude tools supposedly available in 1850s Washington territory. Drainage systems engineered with gradients so perfect that modern civil engineers still study the archival documentation in disbelief. And then came the discovery that puzzled even the most conservative members of the engineering teams: evidence of prolonged water saturation. Stone surfaces smoothed as if shaped by tidal action, lower structures with marine growth patterns, foundations with salt deposits that only form after extended submersion. Yet the official history states that Seattle was built on tidal mudflats that were gradually filled in during the city's early years. Nothing that explains why foundations deep beneath the regraded hills showed signs of having been submerged for far longer than the few decades between settlement and excavation. Survey photographs taken between 1898 and 1911 show this clearly. Workers standing beside stonework so massive that the men look miniature in comparison. Blocks cut so precisely that even today masons examine the images trying to identify what tools could have produced such clean edges. Joints and angles that resemble infrastructure from cities with centuries of development, not a frontier town barely 50 years old. But the most unsettling detail was not what appeared in the photographs. It was what didn't appear in the official records. The reports written during and after the regrade barely mention these discoveries in detail. Some engineering drawings omit entire street levels. Certain structures are summarized with vague terms like earlier fill or pre-settlement debris, even though the photographs show they were far more substantial than that. The silence is hard to miss. Because if these deeper layers truly belong to the pioneer period as officially recorded, Why weren't they documented thoroughly? Why weren't the sophisticated construction techniques described in municipal reports? Why were the photographs scattered across private collections instead of assembled into comprehensive city archives? Even some of the stone foundations raised red flags: edges too sharp, surfaces too smooth, drainage channels too uniform. Marks that looked less like hand-hewn pioneer work and more like industrial fabrication. Fabrication that, according to the conventional timeline, didn't exist in the 1850s Seattle. What the excavation teams uncovered during the regrade were structures that didn't match frontier construction, didn't match the documented building practices of early Seattle, and didn't even seem to come from the same historical period. Instead, they formed a coherent architectural language, one that appeared unified, planned, and impossibly advanced for its supposed era. The first shock came with the street systems themselves. These weren't crude wagon paths or hastily laid boardwalks. They were geometrically precise thoroughfares, roads graded with exact ratios, drainage integrated seamlessly into the design, and infrastructure laid out with coherence that suggested master planning on a scale Seattle supposedly never possessed. Some streets were buried so deep that workers initially thought they had discovered natural rock formations. But once cleared, they revealed paving and curbing that looked untouched since the day they were covered. Smooth surfaces, fitted stones, and construction patterns that raised more questions than answers. And then came the feature that still puzzles researchers today: the giant circular stone wells. Officially, they were labelled as water access points from early settlement, but nothing about them fits typical frontier well design. These were too symmetrical, too deep, and too perfectly rounded, as if they were cut with machinery capable of maintaining flawless curvature over great depths. Some wells were wide enough for multiple workers to descend simultaneously. Others contained internal features that appeared designed for purposes beyond simple water access: chambers, side passages, mechanisms that suggested functions no one could identify. Workers from the early 1900s described them in private correspondence as engineered shafts, not wells, but access points with an unknown purpose. Another anomaly appeared in the placement of certain foundation systems. These weren't simply supporting the structures known to have existed above them. Many were positioned to bear weights far greater than any documented building in early Seattle. Some extended horizontally in ways that made no architectural sense for the wooden commercial blocks supposedly erected in the 1850s and 1860s. It created an uncomfortable possibility. The post-fire Seattle may not simply rest on convenient bedrock and fill. It may sit on something much larger, an urban infrastructure whose extent was never recorded, never taught, and never explained in the official history of the city. The deeper the workers excavated, the stranger the findings became. Foundation blocks appeared with perfectly straight edges. Some surfaces were finished smooth, almost polished. Others showed precision molded lines so clean that modern concrete engineers still debate what methods could have produced them. But the discovery that caused the most confusion was metal reinforcement inside supposedly primitive foundations. Some pieces showed signs of advanced metallurgy, alloys that shouldn't have been available in frontier Seattle. Others appeared fused or integrated in ways that suggested the concrete was poured around prefabricated metal frameworks. The official explanation offered later: debris from the 1889 fire, salvaged materials from collapsed buildings. But that does not explain why the metal appears inside intact foundation blocks in the deepest layers. Not scattered debris, but structural reinforcement placed with engineering precision. That kind of construction requires techniques far beyond frontier capability, far beyond anything documented in 1850s Washington territory. Soon after these discoveries, something unusual began happening. Excavations were filled rapidly with regraded material. Certain areas were covered before proper documentation, could be completed. Deep sections of the old street systems were buried under massive amounts of earth and never reopened. Some of this was officially labelled as practical necessity. The regrade needed to proceed. Development couldn't wait for archaeological study. But the decisions about which areas to bury first and which structures to preserve raised quiet questions among observers. Because the structures that were covered most quickly were always the ones that challenged the official timeline most severely. The perfectly cut wells, the oversized foundations, the sophisticated drainage systems, the street networks that seemed to extend far beyond the excavation zones into areas beneath modern Seattle. These street systems were perhaps the most mysterious find of all. They weren't random paths. They were part of an organized grid, a network of thoroughfares that looked less like frontier sprawl and more like planned urban infrastructure, aligned, measured, engineered, as if they once served a city much larger and more developed than the rough settlement supposedly founded in 1851. And yet, almost as soon as they were uncovered, they were buried again. Their extent unmapped, their purpose unexplored, their existence quietly omitted from subsequent city planning documents. When you study the final years of the Seattle Regrade Projects, something becomes impossible to ignore. The work didn't gradually conclude. The most significant discoveries were actively buried, not preserved, not studied, buried. The deeper the excavation teams went, the more the tone of their documentation changed. Early reports were straightforward, describing routine excavation of expected materials, but later entries become cautious, incomplete, as if the writers were suddenly constrained in what they could record. And this is where the final mystery begins, because the last structures they uncovered beneath downtown Seattle weren't ordinary. They weren't frontier construction, they weren't fire debris, they weren't even identifiable as belonging to any known period of the city's history. They were something else entirely. Multiple accounts, the few that survived, described infrastructure that suddenly shifted from recognizable to inexplicable. Foundation systems with tolerances suggesting industrial construction techniques. Drainage networks designed for a population far larger than pioneer Seattle ever had. Structural supports built for loads that no wooden frontier buildings could have required. And street levels, complete street levels buried so deep that they couldn't possibly align with the official timeline of Seattle's settlement and growth. But here's the part that always gets buried in the historical record. The most sophisticated infrastructure was covered the fastest. Workers described filling entire street systems back in, burying intact foundations, covering engineering works that had just been exposed to daylight for the first time in decades. It wasn't gradual, it was immediate. The official explanation, the regrade had to proceed on schedule, the city needed level land for development, preservation wasn't practical. But if it was only about practical development, why were the most structurally sound, most perfectly preserved sections the ones buried first? And why were obviously damaged areas from the 1889 fire left exposed longer for study? It doesn't make sense unless those deeper discoveries posed a different kind of threat. Not a physical one, a narrative one. Because if the infrastructure beneath Seattle truly showed urban planning and construction sophistication far beyond what frontier settlers should have possessed, and if some of that infrastructure didn't match any documented building period at all, then the entire accepted story of Seattle's founding begins to collapse. Imagine what it would mean if modern Seattle was built on top of something far older, something planned, something engineered, something extensive, something we didn't build, or at least something we've been told we didn't build. Imagine what it means if the original Seattle wasn't the rough lumber town of 1851, but something that existed before, something substantial enough to require deliberate burial rather than simple demolition and replacement. And maybe that is why the discoveries during the regrade were so quickly covered over, not to make room for progress, but to protect a historical narrative that couldn't accommodate what the ground was revealing. The surviving photographs tell their own story. workers standing beside foundations that look almost modern in their precision, street systems laid out with planning sophistication that frontier towns supposedly lacked, infrastructure too extensive, too well engineered for its supposed age. These aren't the kinds of discoveries civic historians like to explain. They're the kinds they prefer not to discuss at all. And that brings us to the final question. Why was the deepest evidence, the most sophisticated infrastructure, the most extensive street systems sealed away under millions of tons of regraded earth? Because when you step back, the pattern becomes clear. The perfect stonework was buried. The mysterious wells were buried. The unexplained street networks were buried. The oversized foundations were buried. The reinforced concrete was buried. And even large portions of the photographic record disappeared, or were scattered across collections where they would never be assembled into a complete picture. Almost as if the Regrade had accidentally revealed a chapter of history that wasn't supposed to surface. A chapter older than the 1851 founding, older than the official settlement narrative, older than the story we were given. And for a brief period between 1898 and 1911, the earth opened just enough to show it. But instead of preserving and studying it, they buried it again, covered it, sealed it, forgot it, or pretended to. Because if Seattle stands on top of an entire city built by people we no longer acknowledge, then the real question is not what was discovered during the Regrade. It's what else lies beneath American cities. What other pioneer towns were built over something far older? What other convenient urban renewal projects buried evidence before anyone thought to document it properly? The Seattle Regrade wasn't just an engineering project to flatten inconvenient hills. It was a glimpse, a brief accidental glimpse into a version of history we were never meant to see. And now that glimpse is your clue, your map, your invitation to question everything we think we know about how the American West was really settled. Because if this is what survived under one city's hills, imagine what still lies beneath the rest. Something out of place, something out of time, something they intentionally built over. Thanks for watching, and if you found this interesting, well, there are a lot more cities with stories like this. Maybe I'll see you in the next one.